Blade of the Grass here. The meaning behind Heaven's Door as a stand could be used to outline the main villain of the JoJo lands. Cause in JoJo parts, the first guy you fight tends to embody the main sort of opposition throughout the wider story. Like the first battle is a mini preview of each part's larger threat. Josuke fights somebody completely incompatible with society for the same reason as Kira, who infiltrates his home and preys on people trying to live their lives. And Giorno fights a subset of the Passion Cage, this one guy who forces people to enter his regulation system they could only be hindered by. And in the new universe, since the main JoJos now have some kind of flaw that they have to realize and then grow out of throughout their part, they're primarily dealing with some kind of inner struggle, which is then paired with a symbolically matching physical or mental condition. JoJo, even more than other series, builds its power system and fantasy world by making the narrative symbolism exist in universe and able to influence things. But with the new universe, it means that each character the main JoJos now fight as their first antagonist relates to their personal character flaws. Miss Robinson seems to not be a stand user and is missing an eye. Training bugs by offering them that eye socket in exchange is a way to improvise around loss, which is the main skill Johnny needs to learn. But it's also shared by the main villains because they cement and accept losses when sometimes they're not necessary. Trying to get functionality out of the socket shows that Miss Robinson's thinking hasn't truly accepted or moved on from that loss, only trying to make up for it by committing to things that dig into the loss further. Because if you want to stand on your own, and not stunt yourself, you can't give in to potential setbacks just because they're easier to work with when you accept them, which is the broader idea behind Valentine's character flaws. So Miss Robinson's embracing of equivalent exchange is almost like a preview of the ideas behind Valentine later in the story. Then in JoJolion, Ojiro is a surfer. For a part where Josuke has to realize he's a man of the land, someone who works where they call home surrounded by their family, and not a man of the sea, someone who has to live offshore from their home to provide for their family, Ojiro doesn't work at all, and his specific hobby is going offshore for fun to let the waves immediately push him back, while clinging to the idea of being a surfer as his identity out of pride. No wonder a dedicated man of the sea like Kira couldn't tolerate the guy. And Fun as a stand has a power that's sort of a preview of Wonder of You, because it also specifically works by symbolizing, cementing, and weaponizing Ojiro's position of power above his targets. So what makes Heaven's Door relate to the main villain depends on how it fits with Jodio's unconscious character flaw and the main theme of Part 9. Cause the main villain, given the new continuity's storytelling motif, is likely going to be somebody who willfully embraces that flaw and anchors a system of inequality because of it. Part 7's about dominance, so the type of systems is authority. Part 8's about what you have, so the type of systems is privilege. And Part 9 seems to be about accountability, so the type of systems might be income or industry. And for a pun, it could be symbolized through accounting. But whatever it ends up being, the main villains tend to start with a source of power that relates to their type of system, which powers their stand, and then they try to enforce a second system of that type while they play their role. So maybe, on top of Rohan sharing Jodio's character flaw, Heaven's Door itself has a distinct trait that's shared with the stand of the main villain. Cause you never know for sure, but it's really not gonna be Rohan. He could be the final opposition, but there's gonna be a character specifically designed for this part to be the ultimate embodiment of Jodio's flaw. And so far, this Rohan has been included in the story because he's indistinguishable from original Rohan, to the point where they could even be the same character as far as anyone can tell. Rohan was brought back so we could use Part 4's version as a reference for what Jodio's flaw is meant to be and how the main villain is going to mirror it. Since stands reflect people's agency, they reward working smarter over working harder. So Heaven's Door initially comes from Rohan's influence creating manga, and he has to learn to manifest it through the superhuman drawing talent that carries his career. The stand symbolizes and expands his ability to write influentially by observing the world around him. Things he reaches become books he can read and write into, and that's why he can't read any facts that he's internally blocked out. But Rohan's initially a villain in Diamond is Unbreakable because he turns people into perpetual machines for providing content, taking up their lives and depriving them of their agency. What makes Heaven's Door special, as a stand, is that it's an accumulation type. Most abilities tend to expand on someone's process for influencing the world by temporarily warping it, or cement their effects on the world by giving them supernatural ways to permanently cause those changes. But Heaven's Door is able to create a feedback loop by symbolizing a process that builds on itself and never ends. The changes Rohan makes to people while they're books can accumulate and stay in effect regardless of distance. So with each page, he's expanding his scope of influence piece by piece, making it easier and easier for Rohan to collect more pages or isolate new targets. But since he's planting additions to his process, that growth is artificial, cause it's maintained by the power itself. So while his stand can boost his own strengths indefinitely, those extensions aren't making permanent consequences, so mentally defeating him and getting him to truly deactivate his stand can undo everything that he's built up. Heaven's Door creates some kind of system that builds up a power over time by fitting things into it. When Rohan's initially a villain, he accumulates it piece by piece to raise his advantages in power disparity while he's on the grind, without any concern for the people he's carving into cogs. And that's the trait and type of stand he will probably share with the main villain. Another motif in JoJo's is that the protagonist's stand is something that has type advantage against whatever the main villain has. In Part 7, Johnny's vessel of individual human agency, his Tusk Act 4, grants him unlimited damage coverage, which acts as a poison against Valentine's singularity vessel of overarching higher powers. Because it lets Johnny push through D4C's barriers and spread his effect thanks to the symbolic relationship between rotation and black holes. Then in Part 8, the ability to freely remove one piece of something is devastating to Toru's power of binding things in intricate chain reactions. So whatever the main villain's stand is for Part 9, Jodio will likely end up with some kind of natural advantage against it. And November Rain might symbolize the power of isolating yourself, but the concept behind the November Rain of the song is that anything that exists in the world, through building blocks like a human life, relies on several building blocks being in alignment, like they're the teeth of these giant slow-turning gears eventually drifting apart. Sorta similar to the limitation of Crazy Diamond, the stand named after that Pink Floyd song that couldn't bring people back to life since it could only reconnect their building blocks by tracing their history. November Rain is the principle of nature that at the 11th hour, something will drift apart until it's beyond repair. The song is specifically about a relationship that's reached an inevitable tough spot. But it's hopeful because something that exists through building blocks isn't those building blocks themselves, meaning there could be a way to preserve it at the 11th hour by substituting some of its building blocks for ones that are still closer to the ones it keeps. Similar to how Crazy Diamond can substitute somebody's body to turn them into a book and preserve them. So November Rain as a song is about how this relationship is falling apart and it's going to face destruction because the other person isolates themselves and won't communicate. But if they work through it together by communicating, acknowledging, and opening up to each other, then at the end of the 11th hour, instead of being destroyed, their relationship could be reborn. And midnight would only signify the rain finally letting up. Jodio's strength isn't just his ability to isolate himself, or the fact that no matter how big the fish in the sea are, he could use the fish filling up each of their shadows as a ladder or stairway to climb above all of them. Jodio's agency is backed by the wider laws of nature, symbolized by gravity and rainfall, to take down anything artificial or that only exists temporarily through people's intentions. It's like rapid water damage. To dislodge or dismantle anything, he can get his stand above. So November Rain's power is built to erode and permanently pull apart something that's gradually built up, and to wash things out and free them. Which is why an accumulation type power, something that expands and continuously maintains territory to boost its influence, is what Jodio would naturally be able to foil. So if the main villain has an accumulation type power, which symbolizes some kind of system of inequality they embrace to fit the other new universe villains, it's gonna depend on what Jodio's actual inner struggle is going to be. And now that we're a decent chunk into the JoJo lands, the story's not hiding it. Jodio from the start has been bothered by people rigging things to keep themselves winning at everyone else's expense, given that his character is pushed down by other people's unfair systems and advantages. But whenever he gets the chance, he takes advantage of power disparity for himself, regardless of how that then consequently affects other innocent people. I mean, he gets a rock above the concept of money and steals for personal gain like he's still an underdog. And he gets a superpower and then burns a bunch of innocent high schoolers because a handful of people in the crowd hurt his brother. Chances are Jodio's issue is that while he's paranoid and condemning the examples of systems he can identify, he's neglecting how his own actions lead to things that appear the same way to others. How easily your actions for your own stability or protection could end up having consequences that look to people like they're being restrained by an invisible wall from the outside. Jodio's just on the grind to climb higher himself, regardless of the impact on the rest of the world. Like if he'd end up hoarding something precious, or if he'd be suffocating others, cause he has no concern about how sustainable his type of behavior would be for everyone to adopt. Since the current villains are reckless corporations and people who accumulate things of value without actually using their value, letting them decay and stunting the rest of the world just for their own security, Part 9 seems to be about accountability, and Jodio needs to learn how mundane acts for self-preservation don't scale up when your money does, and would end up causing overall losses to the world because you're just throwing shared pools of resources into this void instead. One of the reasons the JoJo Lands seems to focus on the idea of money itself, or land, is because unlike individual items, where you can make pretty much any amount of food or tools, the value of money or land specifically comes from them being divisions of shared pools. So you can't make more, because stuff like the numbers of money going up just means the denominator of the fraction each dollar's worth goes up as well. Money isn't a tool you can use by yourself. Its use comes from how you gain things by having it flow from one person, yourself, to another. So if you just hoard money in one place, it only leaves the actual assets Meryl acknowledges its value is supposed to represent to spoil. And opportunities are missed out, both for you and for the rest of the world it's meant to circulate through when you don't spend it. It's like the pitfall of relying on an automatic stand. Keeping a theoretically endless amount of money in one place would automatically shield you from misfortune. But in that time, you could have been proactively spending the money to be adaptive and also increase your ability to earn further. The Howler family's thematic flaw as antagonists is that they hold on to things of value for times of need, stunting their potential in the long term, because they're cutting off their circulation. And their flaw as villains is that they're keeping everyone else from benefiting from the pools of resources they share in the meantime. Because if you have a guarantee of ownership of something, like a magic rock that ensures it'll be returned to you, you wouldn't lose anything if you regularly gave your possessions back to the people that were forced into giving them up. But the Howlers do anyway, because their priorities are about locking in their own prosperity thanks to their pack mentality. The main villain of the entire part would be somebody who does proactively spend their money to secure more passive income, but what would make them an antagonist is that endlessly cementing further sources of income without restraint recklessly limits other people's agency, and what makes them a villain is that they're hoarding those opportunities. If Jodio's flaw is that he's recklessly limiting others through his own ambitions because he fails to identify how even everyday people's mundane acts of self-preservation naturally restrict those around them, the main villain is going to be somebody who's aware of that and embraces it because they don't care. They're going to be somebody climbing higher no matter what, locking in sources of income and getting more and more jobs whenever they can, deliberately ignoring any restrictions that might inherently be created against others through their own routine accumulation, like what made Pulpo hated by Giorno. The system they might adopt could be some kind of corporate structure or career hierarchy then. They're attempting to stabilize their own income by insisting on some kind of status where they sit on top and take the biggest cut, no matter how much they get the people under them to do their work. And since they're plugging up the flow of money and exploit every opportunity to take more for themselves, they're the reason why an idea like trickle-down economics can never work on its own. Because the drive that puts somebody on top fundamentally clashes with the idea of them fairly distributing the profits they're given the opportunity to keep for themselves. Meaning money won't trickle down unless something deliberately adds pressure or causes a downpour to force it to. Since the story strongly implies that the main villain's stand, like the original Heaven's Door, is an accumulation power that gets stronger by adding pieces to a system over time, one where the main villain just grinds and progresses forward, neglecting whenever they push others down to do so, they would be what minced Akka Howler. And because the main villain is someone observant and manipulative, who uses a structural hierarchy to remain sitting on top of different sources and flows of income to disproportionately hoard the rewards of their industries, then given how the series symbolizes things, one of their sources of money, the primary one that's key to their identity, is likely something institutionalized and funded by society itself, like enforced by the government. But with Chapter 24, we're given a scene that specifically portrays one existing character like this. And if Akka Howler's character does reference the Mincer, it doesn't mean the Mincer has to be an actual stand name. It could just be inspiration for his character, like the Great Deceiver from the same album, meaning the stand that minced him could have a totally different namesake. And when you think of something that cuts off people's potential by carving them into boxes, making them pieces of a system that's built up over time, and you think of an institutionalized platform that can be exploited by the people running it to do this, to the people within it for the administration's own comfort and luxury, and you think of a song that's written in terms of a system that's built up brick by brick, the first thing that comes to mind is probably Pink Floyd's The Wall. With the song Another Brick in the Wall Part 2, written out of resentment and scarring from lifelong trauma, where kids are funneled into a meat grinder by the administration of the public school system who are just using their government-mandated jobs for their own comfort instead of to actually benefit those kids, maybe the principal of a government-funded public school whose main identifiable job is paid for by society, but who goes out of her way to look for children to exploit for grueling and life-threatening labor at the expense of their futures and potential that she then makes off with most of the profits from, is the bad guy. The one with several jobs and quick to use any opportunity to earn more. Her recruiting of the Joestars back in Dragona's backstory could have been an unorthodox form of compassion, but it's in Paco's backstory, in the latest chapter, where we're specifically shown that Paco has a weakness where he'll only see the good in an abuse of authority because he's desperate for their affection. And then immediately after that, when his father's sent to prison and he naively works for the gang that set his father up, we're shown how Meryl recruits him by offering the same kind of arrangement, but drawing him, through his weakness, in. Meryl is the evil version of Bruno, with the negligence of Pulpo. If we break down Meryl's 3 jobs that we know about so far, we have the systemically government-funded principal occupation, which fits the subject matter of The Wall. We have the criminal enterprise, where she backseats to do the accounting, takes most of the profits as the boss, and exploits children to do the grueling labor for her benefit, like the school administration in The Wall. And her 3rd job gives her her own territory, a store she can operate out of, where, in her office, behind her throne, she specifically is drawn with a wall where she pins up, fashion designs she creates, the things people wear as crucial symbols of their identities in JoJo. That wall is so on the nose, it could even just be her standability itself, cause providing people false opportunities and boxing them into things, like outfits, while consequently carving away at their potential would be the perfect symbolism for a stand named after Another Brick in the Wall, though I'd imagine it's something more Hellraiser Labyrinth-ish. And also, this would resolve the mystery with her relation to Usagi, and all the King Crimson references throughout the story. Cause King Crimson was originally supposed to be a guy that would rule through mechanisms in the shadows, cause he's embarrassed or scared of other people seeing him. So the person on top of all these invisible systems, in accordance with the part's theme, is somebody in plain view, who's able to use different people's independent goals for their own objectives. The King Crimson songs in the JoJo lands are probably the bricks that Meryl's shaped and placed to power her system. And that means we're likely going to encounter more because she probably has more than 2, and there are specifically 3 parts to Another Brick in the Wall. But as for Usagi, who parallels Jodio throughout the story, he needs people to tell him what roles to fill, and his namesakes are about longing because of someone sent overseas. Jodio was given a role by Meryl to provide for his mother after his father moved away. And we know that Usagi's father died, so if Meryl is his mother, that could be part of why he's desperate, cause he doesn't know what stable role to play without his father as a role model, when trying to provide for the person who assigns every position. And the precursor to Another Brick in the Wall Part 2, Another Brick in the Wall Part 1, uses going overseas as a metaphor for the singer's father dying, which would explain the relevance of Mate Kudasai. And that could mean that Another Brick in the Wall Part 3 might be the one about Meryl's character specifically. That or the different parts represent 3 different bricks, and maybe she processed the Howler family, the second one we were introduced to, by being some kind of teacher for Akka when he was younger. Either way, The Wall is about isolation, how different individual events became bricks that emotionally isolated someone over time, which parallels Jodio. So someone that deliberately walls off other people for their own benefit, rather than walling off themselves, would be a perfect villain. Anyway, because Part 9 seems to be about taking accountability, and that the invisible rules anyone's made aware of are just the shadows of regular people's feelings, so identifying that the sources of what plagues us are the mundane and obvious people in plain view, then if Meryl May's stand is The Wall, then she's going to be the main villain, which is sort of an abstract title, because it could be her consequences that cause internal struggles, while the plot focuses on a different antagonist. With storytelling, it's less that there's a guaranteed outcome, and more that there are connected underlying ideas, which could ultimately manifest in any specific way. And given the parts elements so far, there could be something major related to the Howler's pack mentality, or something tied to the spider from the It TV adaptation. But the point is, musical inspiration doesn't always result in a stand, and Meryl May being pretty blatantly inspired by The Wall, as of this latest chapter, doesn't mean she's the main villain. But if it's what her stand is named after, then she's definitely going to be.